The most important promise my husband ever made to me sounded so ordinary that I almost forgot it, until the day it changed everything. My name is Emily Carter, and if you had met my husband Daniel, you would have understood why people trusted him so easily. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays without a reminder, who brought coffee to neighbors after a storm, and who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with new friends. For 23 years, Daniel was my partner in every sense of the word. We built a life together in a quiet Ohio town, raised a daughter who had recently started her own family, and spent countless evenings on our back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. From the outside, our life looked simple. Maybe it was. But it was also happy. What most people never understood was that Daniel's relationship with his family had always been complicated. His mother, Margaret, believed family loyalty should come before everything else. His older brother, Brian, seemed to measure success by what someone owned rather than who they were. They were polite to me when Daniel was around, but there was always a distance I could feel. A look that lasted a little too long. A comment that sounded kind until you thought about it later. Daniel noticed it too, though he rarely spoke about it. Whenever I asked why his family acted differently toward me, he would smile, squeeze my hand, and say, "One day, they'll see what I see." I wanted to believe him. Over the years, Daniel built a successful consulting business. It wasn't the kind of company that made headlines, but it provided a comfortable life. We paid off our mortgage, took road trips across the country, and even bought a small lake cabin where we escaped on summer weekends. Yet no matter how much time passed, Margaret and Brian seemed more interested in Daniel's achievements than his happiness. During family gatherings, conversations always drifted toward investments, property values, or future inheritances. Daniel would change the subject whenever he could. One autumn evening, about a year before everything changed, we were sitting on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cool air. The sky was turning orange, and the neighborhood was quiet. Daniel stared out toward the trees for a long moment before speaking. "If something ever happens to me," he said softly, "promise me you'll trust me, even if things stop making sense at first." I laughed and told him he sounded dramatic. He smiled but didn't laugh back. "Promise me anyway." So I did. I promised. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and held up a small brass key. "And when the time comes," he said, turning it between his fingers, "remember that not everything important comes in the first envelope." Before I could ask what he meant, he slipped the key back into his pocket and changed the subject. At the time, I thought it was just one of Daniel's strange little mysteries. I had no idea that those words would become the beginning of a story no one in our family was prepared for, and a secret that would remain hidden until it was almost too late. 6 months after that conversation on the porch, I found myself standing in a crowded church wondering how a life could change so completely in such a short time. The previous winter had been unusually cold, and Daniel had spent weeks talking about the projects he wanted to finish before summer. He had plans for the lake cabin. He wanted to rebuild the dock. He wanted to take our granddaughter fishing for the first time. He had a list written on a yellow notepad sitting beside his favorite chair. None of those plans happened. The morning of the funeral felt unreal. Friends, neighbors, former co-workers, and distant relatives filled every row. People came up to me one after another sharing stories about Daniel's kindness. Some laughed. Some cried. I thanked them all, but most of the day felt like a blur. I remember looking at the framed photograph near the front of the room and thinking that Daniel looked as if he might walk through the door at any moment and apologize for making everyone worry. Margaret sat in the front row beside Brian. Both accepted condolences with solemn expressions, but something felt different. I could not explain it. Every time someone mentioned Daniel's business or financial success, Brian seemed unusually attentive. More than once, I noticed him exchanging quiet glances with his mother. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Grief has a way of making ordinary moments seem suspicious. Still, a feeling of unease settled over me. After the service, family members gathered at Margaret's house. Conversations drifted through the rooms while coffee brewed in the kitchen. I stepped into the hallway looking for a quiet place to breathe when I heard voices coming from the study. The door was not completely closed. I recognized Brian immediately. "The lawyer said everything is scheduled for next week," he said. "Once the paperwork is done, things should move quickly." There was a pause. Then Margaret answered. "That is how Daniel wanted it." Their words were not shocking by themselves. Of course, legal matters had to be handled eventually. But the tone bothered me. Daniel had been gone only a few days. Yet they sounded less like a grieving family and more like people preparing for a business meeting. Before I could hear anything else, footsteps approached and the conversation ended. A few days later, I returned home and began sorting through Daniel's office. I was not looking for anything important. I simply wanted to feel close to him. His desk remained exactly as he had left it. Pens lined up neatly. Business folders stacked in perfect order. The yellow notepad still rested beside the chair. As I opened drawers and organized papers, I found myself remembering his words from that autumn evening. "Trust me, even if things stop making sense at first." The sentence echoed in my mind. Then another detail returned. The brass key. I searched the desk, the cabinets, and every small box I could find, but the key was nowhere. Maybe I was remembering incorrectly. Maybe it was stored somewhere else. Yet the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Daniel had wanted me to remember it for a reason. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from an attorney's office requesting my presence at a formal family meeting. The date was set for the following Tuesday morning. As I read the letter, a strange chill ran through me. Something told me that the meeting was not going to bring answers. It was only going to create more questions. The attorney's office occupied the top floor of a brick building overlooking the town square. On Tuesday morning, I arrived 10 minutes early, hoping a few extra moments would help settle my nerves. They did not. Margaret and Brian were already there when I entered the conference room. Brian sat comfortably in his chair scrolling through his phone while Margaret reviewed a stack of documents. Neither seemed surprised to see me. In fact, they looked prepared. That was the first thing that bothered me. The second was the attorney himself. Robert Hastings had handled Daniel's legal affairs for years. Normally, he greeted people with warmth and confidence. That morning, however, he appeared unusually tense. He kept adjusting his glasses and organizing papers that were already perfectly arranged. After everyone took their seats, he cleared his throat and began reviewing standard legal information. Most of it passed by in a blur. I focused on Daniel's name printed across the top of the documents and tried to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. Then Robert opened a folder and started reading the terms of Daniel's estate. At first, everything sounded ordinary. The business assets were listed. The investment accounts were identified. The properties were catalogued. But as the reading continued, confusion slowly replaced grief. The primary residence, the lake cabin, and several major financial accounts were being transferred to Margaret Carter. Additional business interests and investment holdings were assigned to Brian Carter. I waited for Robert to continue. I waited for the part where Daniel explained his plans for me. Instead, Robert turned another page and announced that I would receive a small collection of personal keepsakes, including family photographs, several letters, and Daniel's grandfather's pocket watch. Then he stopped speaking. For several seconds, the room remained silent. I looked at Robert, expecting him to continue reading. He did not. I looked down at the documents in front of me. Surely there had been a mistake. Daniel and I had built our life together. We had made every major decision side by side. The idea that he would leave nearly everything to his mother and brother made no sense. None at all. Across the table, Brian leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Margaret lowered her eyes, but I caught the briefest hint of satisfaction on her face before she concealed it. Robert finally spoke again. His voice sounded careful. Too careful. He explained that these documents represented the most recent instructions currently filed with his office. The phrase caught my attention immediately. Currently filed. It was an odd choice of words. Before I could ask what he meant, Brian stood and announced that Daniel had always believed family should take care of family. Margaret nodded in agreement. The statement sounded rehearsed. As the meeting concluded, I noticed Robert gathering the papers with unusual hesitation. Then, for a split second, our eyes met. Something passed across his face. It was not sympathy. It was not guilt. It was concern. The kind of concern someone carries when they know part of a story has not yet been told. As everyone prepared to leave, Robert quietly handed me a sealed copy of the estate documents. His fingers paused for an instant before letting go. Then he said something that seemed completely ordinary at the time. "Mrs. Carter, I would strongly recommend keeping every document your husband ever gave you, no matter how insignificant it may seem." The moment I stepped outside, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Daniel had asked me to trust him if things stopped making sense. And nothing about this made sense. The drive home from the attorney's office felt longer than it ever had before. I replayed every word from the meeting again and again, searching for some explanation that would make the situation reasonable. But the harder I tried, the less sense it made. Daniel was thoughtful about everything. He planned family vacations 6 months in advance. He kept detailed records of household expenses. He left notes reminding me to water plants while he was away on business trips. This was not a man who would accidentally leave behind confusion. If he had wanted his mother and brother to inherit everything, he would have explained it to me. Yet he never had. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a vehicle parked across the street. Brian was standing near the mailbox talking on his phone. The moment he saw me, he ended the call and walked over with a smile that looked more practiced than sincere. He asked how I was holding up, but before I could answer, he shifted the conversation toward practical matters. He mentioned that there would likely be discussions about the house soon. Then he casually noted that maintaining a property of this size could be difficult for someone living alone. His words were polite, but the message underneath them was clear. He already viewed the house as something that belonged to him and Margaret. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the documents Robert had given me. Something continued to bother me. Not only the outcome, but the behavior of everyone involved. Margaret and Brian had not seemed surprised by anything they heard. They had acted as though they already knew exactly what the documents contained. The following morning, Margaret called. Her tone sounded gentle, almost sympathetic. She told me she knew the situation must be difficult and suggested that I begin considering future living arrangements. I nearly dropped the phone. Daniel had been gone only a short time, and already his family was discussing where I should live. When I reminded her that I had spent more than 2 decades building that home with Daniel, she responded with a sentence that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. "Sometimes we have to accept what people really wanted, Emily." The statement felt wrong. Deeply wrong. That evening I began searching through every box, drawer, and cabinet in Daniel's office. Robert's advice echoed in my mind. Keep every document your husband ever gave you, no matter how insignificant it may seem. For hours I sorted through old business records, tax documents, travel receipts, and handwritten notes. Most of it appeared completely ordinary. Then, near the back of a filing cabinet, I discovered a small wooden box I had never seen before. It was not locked. Inside were several family photographs, a few greeting cards, and a folded piece of paper with Daniel's handwriting. My heart raced as I opened it. The note contained only a single sentence. "If you are reading this, you are asking the right questions." Beneath the sentence was a simple drawing. It was not a map. It was not directions. It was a sketch of a brass key. The same brass key Daniel had shown me on the porch months before. Suddenly, every memory returned with perfect clarity. The key. The promise. The warning about trusting him when things stopped making sense. And most importantly, his final remark that autumn evening. Not everything important comes in the first envelope. For the first time since the attorney's meeting, I felt something other than grief. I felt certainty. Daniel had left a trail. And somehow, I had just found the first piece of it. The next morning, I placed the handwritten note on the kitchen table and stared at the sketch of the brass key for nearly an hour. Daniel had never been careless with his words. If he left a message, there was a reason. If he left a clue, there was a purpose behind it. The challenge was figuring out what he wanted me to find. I began searching the house again, this time with a completely different mindset. I was no longer looking for a missing object. I was trying to think the way Daniel thought. Over 23 years of marriage, I had learned that he loved patterns. He often hid birthday gifts in places that connected to old family memories. He left notes inside books that held special meaning. If the key existed somewhere in the house, it would probably be connected to a story only the two of us understood. By late afternoon, I had searched nearly every room without success. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and drive to the lake cabin. The property sat about 40 miles away, tucked beside a quiet stretch of water surrounded by tall trees. It had always been Daniel's favorite place. Whenever life became complicated, he escaped there to think. As I unlocked the front door, a familiar sense of peace settled over me. Everything looked exactly as we had left it the previous summer. The fishing rod still hung on the wall. Family photographs remained on the shelves. Even Daniel's old coffee mug sat beside the window overlooking the lake. I spent several hours cleaning and organizing, hoping something would trigger a memory. Then I noticed a framed photograph near the fireplace. It showed Daniel and me standing beside the cabin shortly after we bought it. On the back of the frame, written in black marker, was a date and a short message. The best investments are not always the ones people can see. My pulse quickened. Daniel had used that exact phrase years earlier during a conversation about family. He was not talking about money at the time. He was talking about trust. Carefully removing the backing from the frame, I discovered a folded piece of paper hidden between the photograph and the cardboard support. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Inside was a copy of a bank safe deposit box agreement. The document listed a local branch less than 10 miles from our home. More importantly, the agreement referenced a private box registered solely under Daniel's name. Attached to the document was another note written in his familiar handwriting. You will know when it is time. Below the sentence was a sequence of numbers that looked like an access code. Suddenly the brass key made sense. It was not for a drawer or a cabinet. It belonged to the safe deposit box. My heart raced as dozens of questions flooded my mind. Why had Daniel hidden this from everyone? What was inside the box? Why had he prepared clues instead of simply telling me? Before I could process any of it, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Brian's name. I hesitated before answering. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He informed me that he and Margaret had scheduled a meeting with a realtor to discuss the future of the house. Then he added something that immediately caught my attention. There is no point delaying the inevitable, Emily. Everything is already settled. After the call ended, I looked back at Daniel's note. For the first time, I was certain Brian was wrong. Nothing was settled. Not even close. The following morning, I drove directly to the bank listed on the safe deposit box agreement. The entire trip felt surreal. Only a few weeks earlier, my biggest concern had been learning how to navigate life without Daniel. Now I was following a trail of clues he had carefully hidden years before. Part of me worried I was building false hope. Another part remembered the confidence in his voice the night he asked me to trust him. When I arrived, the branch manager reviewed my identification and the paperwork I had discovered behind the photograph. After several minutes, she disappeared into a back office and returned carrying a folder. She explained that Daniel had established specific instructions regarding the box. Access would be granted to me only after his passing and only if I presented both the agreement and the numerical code attached to the note. My heart pounded as I recited the sequence from memory. The manager compared the numbers to a document in her folder and nodded. A few minutes later, she escorted me into a secure room and placed a small metal box on the table before leaving me alone. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. After everything that had happened, this ordinary container suddenly felt more important than any object I had ever seen. I opened it carefully. Inside were several folders, a sealed envelope, a flash drive, and something else that immediately caught my attention. A brass key. The exact key Daniel had shown me on the porch. Seeing it brought tears to my eyes. For a moment, it felt as though he were sitting across from me, quietly guiding me forward. I picked up the sealed envelope first. Written across the front in Daniel's handwriting were 6 words. Not yet. Read everything else first. It was such a Daniel thing to do that I almost laughed. Even now, he was directing the process. I opened the first folder and began reading. What I found left me stunned. The documents were not about money. They were records. Detailed records. Emails. Financial statements. Property agreements. Business correspondence. Everything was organized chronologically. As I worked through the pages, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Over several years, Daniel had documented repeated situations involving Brian and Margaret. There were requests for money that had never been repaid. Promises that had been broken. Attempts to pressure him into financial arrangements he had refused. Notes written in Daniel's own hand described conversations he found troubling. Yet none of it suggested anger. Instead, it seemed as though he had been gathering information. Observing. Preparing. By the time I reached the final folder, my hands were shaking. At the top was a document bearing the logo of Robert Hastings' law office. Unlike the estate documents read during the family meeting, this file referenced a separate legal instruction package. The date was recent. Very recent. More recent than the documents Margaret and Brian had celebrated. Attached to the file was a note from Robert himself confirming receipt of additional materials that were to remain confidential until specific conditions had been met. My pulse quickened. Additional materials. Separate instructions. Confidential conditions. Suddenly Robert's behavior at the attorney's office made perfect sense. He had known there was more to the story. He simply could not reveal it yet. Then I noticed one final page clipped to the back of the file. It contained a scheduled date only 3 days away. Beneath it were the words, "Family Review Session. Mandatory attendance." As I stared at the page, I finally understood. Daniel had never intended the first meeting to be the end of anything. It had merely been the beginning. The 3 days leading up to the family review session felt longer than the previous 3 weeks combined. I spent every spare moment studying the contents of the safe deposit box, trying to understand what Daniel had been building. The more I read, the clearer one fact became. He had not been collecting information out of resentment. He had been documenting behavior. Every file, every note, and every record pointed toward the same conclusion. Daniel wanted the truth preserved. Not for himself, but for whoever would eventually need to see it. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived at Robert Hastings' office carrying the folders from the bank. This time, I felt different. The confusion that had consumed me after the first estate meeting had been replaced by determination. When I entered the conference room, Margaret and Brian were already seated. Their confidence was impossible to miss. Brian casually discussed renovation ideas for the lake cabin while Margaret reviewed property tax estimates. They spoke as though ownership had already been finalized. Neither seemed concerned about why a second meeting had been scheduled. Robert entered a few minutes later carrying a thick portfolio. Unlike the previous meeting, he appeared calm. Focused. Prepared. After everyone sat down, he began by reviewing several legal requirements related to estate administration. Brian looked bored. Margaret glanced repeatedly at her watch. Then Robert opened the portfolio and removed a sealed envelope. The moment I saw it, my breath caught. It matched the envelope still sitting inside Daniel's safe deposit box. Same paper. Same handwriting. Same unmistakable preparation. Brian immediately frowned. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. Robert explained that Daniel had submitted supplemental legal instructions under a confidential estate provision. Those instructions could only be activated after specific conditions had been met. One of those conditions required completion of the initial estate review. Another required a waiting period. The room grew silent. Robert carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Then he began reading Daniel's words aloud. Daniel addressed all three of us by name. He wrote that if the letter was being read, events had unfolded exactly as he expected. He explained that he loved his family, but he had spent years observing how differently people behaved when they believed money was involved. He wrote that character is easiest to recognize when no one believes they are being watched. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Daniel revealed that the original estate documents had never been intended as his final instructions. They were part of a test. A deliberate test. According to the letter, he wanted to see how individuals would treat one another when they believed they had gained power, security, or advantage. My eyes moved toward Margaret and Brian. Their expressions had completely changed. For the first time since Daniel's passing, neither looked confident. Robert continued reading. Daniel described specific situations he had documented over several years. He referenced conversations, financial requests, and family interactions that had influenced his decisions. None of the details were cruel. None were vindictive. They were simply factual. Yet their impact was unmistakable. Finally, Robert reached the last page of the letter. The room became so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Daniel concluded by stating that the documents reviewed during the first meeting represented only the beginning of his plan. His true intentions were contained within an entirely separate package of instructions. Robert closed the letter and placed it on the table. Then he looked directly at Margaret and Brian before speaking. The next documents will determine the final distribution of the estate. At that moment, I realized Daniel's test was over. And the real decision was about to be revealed. No one spoke for several seconds after Robert's announcement. The confidence that had filled the room earlier seemed to disappear instantly. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Margaret stared at the documents in front of her. For the first time since Daniel's passing, neither appeared certain about what would happen next. Robert opened another folder from the portfolio and carefully arranged several documents across the conference table. His movements were calm and deliberate. It was obvious he had reviewed these papers many times before. He explained that Daniel had created a secondary estate structure that would only become active after the completion of the evaluation process described in his letter. The legal framework had been established years earlier and updated regularly. Every requirement had been reviewed, witnessed, and properly recorded. Then Robert began reading the final instructions. Daniel wrote that wealth was never the most important thing he intended to leave behind. He believed that money could support people, but character determined what they did with it. He explained that the first estate documents were designed to create an opportunity for everyone involved to reveal their priorities. Some people, he wrote, become more generous when they gain power. Others become more entitled. The difference matters. As Robert continued reading, specific provisions were revealed one by one. The family home would not transfer to Margaret. The lake cabin would not transfer to Brian. Several investment accounts listed during the first meeting would also remain outside their control. Instead, those assets belonged to a trust established under a completely different legal arrangement. The trust's sole beneficiary was me. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Every major asset Daniel and I had built together had been protected. The house. The cabin. The investment portfolio. Even voting control of his company. Everything had been placed inside the trust years before the first estate documents were ever drafted. The room remained silent except for Robert's voice. Brian suddenly interrupted, insisting there had to be some mistake. Robert calmly explained that there was none. The legal structure had been reviewed by multiple professionals and updated repeatedly over time. Daniel had anticipated potential challenges and documented every decision carefully. Margaret asked why Daniel would do such a thing. Robert did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed her a final page from Daniel's letter. As she read it, her expression slowly changed. Later, Robert allowed me to read the same passage. Daniel wrote that true family is not measured by blood, obligation, or inheritance. It is measured by loyalty, respect, and consistent love. He explained that during the most difficult years of his life, I had stood beside him without asking for anything in return. When business struggled, I supported him. When opportunities required sacrifice, I sacrificed alongside him. Every success they admired had been built through a partnership. Therefore, the future of everything we created together should remain with the person who helped create it. No one argued after that. There was simply nothing left to dispute. Every document supported the same conclusion. Every signature was valid. Every instruction was clear. As the meeting finally came to an end, Brian and Margaret quietly gathered their belongings. Neither looked at me as they left the room. I remained seated, staring at the stack of papers that had transformed weeks of confusion into certainty. Yet even then, one mystery remained unsolved. The sealed envelope inside the safe deposit box still sat unopened. Daniel had specifically instructed me to read everything else first. Now, at last, there was nothing left standing between me and whatever final message he had chosen to leave behind. That evening, I returned home carrying the sealed envelope Daniel had instructed me not to open until everything else was complete. The house felt different now. For weeks, every room had been filled with uncertainty. Questions lingered in every corner. Doubts followed me from one day to the next. But now the confusion was gone. Daniel's plan had worked exactly as he intended. The truth had revealed itself. Yet somehow, I sensed that the envelope resting on the kitchen table contained something even more important than the legal documents. I made a cup of coffee and sat in Daniel's favorite chair. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The same golden light that had filled our porch on the evening he asked me to trust him now stretched across the living room floor. For a long moment, I simply held the envelope in my hands. Then I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The first line brought tears to my eyes immediately. If you are reading this, then you kept your promise. I paused and took a deep breath before continuing. Daniel wrote that he knew the weeks following his passing would be difficult. He understood that I would feel hurt, confused, and perhaps even betrayed when the first documents were revealed. He apologized for that pain. But he explained that he needed me to see something with complete clarity. Not because he wanted revenge. Not because he wanted to punish anyone. He simply wanted the truth to become impossible to ignore. He wrote that people often reveal their real priorities when they believe no consequences are coming. In those moments, excuses disappear and character becomes visible. Over the years, he had watched carefully. Not with anger. Not with judgment. With understanding. He knew his family loved him in their own way. But he also knew that their relationship with success, money, and inheritance had changed them. The test had never been designed to humiliate anyone. It was designed to remove all uncertainty. Then the tone of the letter shifted. Daniel stopped writing about legal matters entirely and began writing about us. He described the first apartment we shared when we could barely afford rent. He remembered road trips in an aging sedan that overheated every summer. He laughed about the weekend we accidentally painted an entire bedroom the wrong color and spent 2 days fixing it together. Page after page contained memories I thought only I still carried. Reading them felt like hearing his voice one final time. Near the end of the letter, I found the sentence that would stay with me forever. The greatest investment of my life was never a business, a property, or an account. It was the life we built together. Tears blurred the words as I continued reading. Daniel explained that everything he left behind would eventually fade. Companies would change. Markets would rise and fall. Buildings would age. But the kindness we shared, the family we created, and the years we spent loving one another were the only things that truly mattered. The final paragraph was short. Just a few lines. He thanked me for every sacrifice I had made. He thanked me for believing in him when success was uncertain. And then he ended with the same promise that had started the entire journey. Trust me, Emily. Even when things stopped making sense at first. As I folded the letter and looked out the window at the fading sunset, I finally understood what Daniel had really left behind. It was never about money. It was never about property. The second envelope contained something far more valuable. It contained certainty, truth, and a final reminder that real wealth is measured by the people who stand beside us when there is nothing to gain. And in that moment, for the first time since losing him, I felt completely at peace.